Ready.
Ready? Good morning, colleagues. We are meeting here today to celebrate the Public Service Month.
We're not live. We're not live yet. Just wait.
Okay, you tell me when you're ready.
The people needs to come into the room.
Good morning, colleagues.
They're not in.
We are meeting here today to celebrate the Public Service Month.
We're not live. We're not live yet. Just wait.
Okay, you tell me when you're ready.
The people needs to come into the room.
Good morning, colleagues.
They're not in.
Hi, Marty. I think it is playing what is recorded. I'm not talking anymore. A very good morning to all of you colleagues, and welcome to this celebration of the Public Service Month. Colleagues, public administration is a cornerstone of all society's functions, including the economy, the safety, all-round security and well-being of citizens, and the emergence and thriving of private enterprise depend on a capable, responsive, and efficient administration, which is able to put in place just laws, ensure the diligent implementation as well as enforcement. The COVID-19 pandemic, colleagues, has presented major challenges and complexity to all countries in the world, including South Africa, and has put public administration or the management of public affairs in the spotlight. The pandemic presents risks of reversing the gains we made in the fight against poverty, unemployment, and inequality in already under economic contraction that led to job losses, among others. However, because of your resilience and commitment, we led a series of non-pharmaceutical measures that enabled us to contain the pandemic, to save jobs, and to continue to ensure that services are uninterruptedly delivered to our people. The successes that we have registered in 2020 and in 2021 are testament to our efforts as public servants and are worthy of celebration. If not well managed, the COVID-19 pandemic places South Africa at risk of an immense economic and social catastrophe, which could lead to human crises that deepen poverty, unemployment, inequality, further undermining the legitimacy of our institutions. This is the second Public Service Month that we are celebrating in the context of the increasing complexity presented by the COVID-19 pandemic, which continues to necessitate shifts in how we do things, in how we respond to citizens, and how citizens express their expectations from us, their servants. This complexity propels us to think differently and to do things not only to remain relevant, but also to service our mandate to the people who give legitimacy to our existence as public organizations. The Public Service Month serves as a reminder of what it means to serve communities and also to look at the type of impact that government has and can make. Let us continue to embrace the shifts and respond accordingly through building a capable, responsive, proactive, and dynamic public service. I welcome you all to this webinar. We have Dr. Niva Makgetla and Prof. Maseremule, who will take us through the reimagining and developing public service skills in the time of COVID through the economic and academic perspectives. Colleagues, Dr. Niva Makgetla has been a senior economist at the Trade and Industry Policy Strategies TIPS since November 2015. She was the DDG for Economic Policy in the Economic Development Department from 2010 to 2015. Before joining the EDD, the Department of Economic Development, Dr. Makgetla worked at the Presidency, the DBSA, as well as COSATU and other government departments. Prior to 1994, she worked in various universities in Africa and the United States. She is currently a member of the National Minimum Wage Commission. Dr. Makgetla's research and publication center on industrial policy and value chain analysis with a focus on mining dependency and on socio-economic challenges facing South Africa, especially employment creation, inequality, and climate emergency, and more recently, the impact of COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Maseremule holds a D.Litt at Phil in Public Administration from the University of South Africa. He is the Chief Editor of the Journal of Public Administration, Professor of Public Affairs and Executive Dean of the Faculty of Humanities at the Tshwane University of Technology. Prof. Maseremule has more than 50 publications to his name, which comprise articles in scholarly, professional, and political journals, chapters in books and research papers, as well as in conference proceedings. Professor Maseremule has supervised 20 master's and 7 doctoral students so far. He has presented more than 40 papers in national and international conferences. He undertook various strategic assignments for the country, which among others include being part of the team that reviewed the Single Public Service Bill for the Ministry of Public Service and Administration, which was subsequently promulgated into law. He did policy research on the place of state-owned enterprises in the developmental state for the Presidential Review Committee on State-Owned Enterprises. He was part of the expert reference group on the Presidential Remuneration Review Committee. Colleagues, I welcome you to this webinar on the celebration of the Public Service Month. And I would like to call on Dr. Niva Makgetla to come to fore to present on reimagining and developing public service skills in the time of COVID-19 through an academic perspective. Dr. Makgetla, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me try and share my screen. So I was asked to speak about how we would think about reimagining and developing public service skills in the time of COVID from the standpoint of economics. And maybe I should note that besides having been at EDD, I spent about 3 years as chief negotiator for the state as employer at Public Service and Administration. So these are things I have spent some time on. I want to first talk just briefly about the impact of the pandemic, because I think it's easy to oversee how disruptive it was in some ways. Then at the implications for the public service, and then at the implications for skilled needs. Now, if we look at the impacts of the pandemic on the economy, it was very disruptive, as I said. But there's also been quite a strong recovery and growth, although much less so in inequality. The GDP recovery was really from a downturn in the second quarter of 2021 when the GDP dropped by 17%. And you can see in the graph how extraordinary that decline was, but also how strong the bounce back was thereafter. Nonetheless, even though growth is still going at about close to 5% a year, which is very high for South Africa, the GDP now is still 1.4% below 2019. And for context, that's about how much it declined in the global economic crisis. Obviously, the hardest hit industries remain hospitality and tourism because they are inherently risky during the pandemic. So any business that requires social gatherings is going to be harder hit by COVID-19. And I'm flagging that because I think it's easy to act as if it's just about public health regulations, but actually it's about people's behavior and the kinds of services people want to consume during a pandemic. In the rest of the economy, what we've seen is, like I said, a very rapid recovery, but it's been fueled by international metals prices, which are very volatile. And in fact, they haven't been doing so well in recent months. So we just have to hope they stay high. But also the global auto industry, which also did a very strong recovery, but has had some supply chain problems in recent months again. So in some ways, our recovery is dependent on the rest of the global economy recovering, and that's still very hard to predict. And then finally, we only have data up to the second quarter, which means the impacts of the third wave and the protests in July aren't actually reflected in recovery data. It's quite possible that we'll see a setback in the next quarter. Nonetheless, what I think we can say is economies recover fast when people just have to recover to doing what they've always done. The trouble with tourism and hospitality is they have to do things differently, and they clearly find that difficult. But I think that the recovery, as opposed to developing an economy which is dynamic in the long run, is actually doing pretty well considering. But what we have seen is that the downturn has deepened inequality, and the most obvious indicator of that is the loss in jobs. So in every crisis, the recovery in jobs tends to be slower than the recovery in the GDP. But when you have such a big fall as we saw, that's a really serious impact. So we still have as of the second quarter, we still had over 1 million jobs less than we did before the pandemic. That's about 7% decline. So basically around 1 in 15 workers has not returned to their livelihoods before the pandemic. And I think what you can see from the graph is that virtually all job losses were amongst lower level workers. And by the way, almost all were among people under the age of 30 because of the last in, first out principle that most companies apply. I think one of the things that helped was we had these extensive relief programs, the most extensive in the region, some of the most extensive in the developing world. That is the temporary employer relief scheme from the UIF, which aimed to prevent retrenchments, and the special 350 rand grant for others who had no income. And just to flag, 350 rand is around 2/3 of the poverty line, but still it was something. Having said that, one of the reasons I think you saw significant job losses amongst formal workers in the last quarter was because the tourists has begun to phase out. And so employers always told us they would start retrenching when they stopped getting the tourists in some cases. I'm afraid that's what we're seeing. And the result is that in the last quarter, you can see the informal sector is basically back to where it was in the first quarter of 2020 before the pandemic. Domestic workers are not that far behind, but formal workers lost a lot of jobs in the last quarter. And I think that's particularly rough for inequality because it effectively both reflects scarring in the economy, but also impacts on our very small and tentative middle class, which is a critical factor for both social cohesion and long-term development. But it's not just the inequalities in employment that are leading to higher inequality. We've also seen a loss of around 10% of formal small businesses and a disproportionate number of Black-owned businesses. So the number of Black-owned businesses declined by close to 15%. Remote learning also has a bigger impact on low-income households because they're less likely to have, on the one hand, digital connections that are functional, but also because they're less likely to have, separate space for learning, parents who can help them, all of those things. A third problem has been the asset bubble that in response to the crisis globally and in South Africa, reserve banks reduced the interest rate. That's pushed up the value of other financial assets and also of houses and cars. And that means people with those assets, which is really completely disproportionately the richest 5% of households, has become even richer. But most households don't have any of those assets in a real way. And finally, of course, relatively well-off people have had more access to vaccines and are more able to work from home. So the vaccine system has been very biased for people who have their own transport and have smartphones or other digital access. So in a whole variety of ways, like most crises, low-income people, working-class people have faced the brunt of the crisis. Given that South Africa has always been one of the most unequal countries in the world, well, at least for the last 100 years, that's puts even greater strains on society than in other countries. A third impact has been on government resources, and obviously this is particularly important for the public sector. Generally, what the graph shows, you can see, is that we've had mostly a pro-cyclical stance, in the sense these are all growth rates. That if you look at expenditure, irrespective of, in fact, in some ways, irrespective of revenue, expenditures tended to follow the GDP. So what our GDP did was we had the downturn in 2008, 2009, which is global financial crisis. Sorry, I don't know why this did that. But then it ticked up because of the global commodity boom, and all of this growth here was driven by really high export prices for our mining commodities in particular. When those prices crashed after 2011, so did growth, and our spending tended to just follow growth downward. Then what you saw more recently is that in the pandemic downturn, first in 2019, just to be clear, we put a lot of money into ESCOM, and that led to a 5% increase in the budget as a whole. And that is, of course, a continuous drain. But during the pandemic, we didn't actually increase spending, but we didn't cut it, even though our revenues went through the floor because of the decline in GDP. Because taxes are very sensitive to GDP because they're largely on things like profits, as well as wages and turnover, and those are things that are more volatile than the GDP. What's happened, proposed for 2021 budget, is that they plan to cut spending by 2% despite an anticipated recovery in revenues in order to reduce the deficit. So the main mechanisms that they had for cutting spending was actually just to cut public servants' pay in real terms across the board, as I'm sure everybody here knows. It's not clear they're going to manage that or to what extent they'll manage that. But what that results in terms of the structure of the budget is the biggest cuts to labor-intensive services, including education, healthcare, and police, which is, of course, very counterintuitive. But the reason I think they wanted to cut remuneration was because they were trying to avoid the very hard process of cutting targeted programs. It's much easier to say, can we do an across-the-board cut on something like remuneration, assuming you have the power to do it, which it's not clear that they do. But the result of all of this has been a significant increase in the deficit because of that, mostly because of the decline in remuneration, which was partially offset after 2020 would be toward the end of 2020 and then early 2021, because of the increase in exports and the recovery in the economy. Nonetheless, debt service is expected, it was 8% in 2011, it rose to 11% in 2019, it's expected to reach 13% in 2021 and 16% in 2023. In other words, for every rand that we take in revenue, 16% goes back to pay our creditors. We'll go back to pay our creditors, and already it's more than 10% that goes to pay creditors. So that's why Treasury is cutting spending, whether, the implications for economic growth, but also for the ability of the public service to function, obviously is extreme. So if we look at the implications for the public service, you can see this in terms of, on the one hand, the demands on the public service are increasing and changing, and on the other hand, the scope for resourcing and the kinds of resources we use have to become more innovative. So firstly, I think we've all experienced this, and we obviously saw it in July. Where you have increasing inequality and increasing stress on households, you get anger and you get more stress. And that leads to increasing demands of all kinds on the public service, as well as protest action and so on. There's a growing need for government services, especially for working class communities. At the same time, they're less and less able to pay for them. So some obvious things are healthcare and the vaccination campaign, that to make up the deficits in education is going to require a huge amount of innovation and resources that may or may not be there at this point. Certainly, there's not really scope at this point in terms of the current budget to increase spending. So the question is, how can you generate education more efficiently, particularly in lower income and working class communities where education has always been very problematic? And then finally, there's the issue of relief for the jobless and for the hospitality sector. So arguably, one of the things that led to the protest action in July was that they cut off the special grants and the UIF tours in March. They have since reinstated them. But this is where you get into these hard trade-offs, because clearly the protest action cost the country a lot more than the social grants and the UIF tours. And that's the problem, is that if you don't provide these services, the cost can become much greater, but the cost of providing them is on your budget. The cost of not providing them tends to appear off budget in the hit to the economy and society. And then finally, there's the Reconstruction and Recovery Program, which really has 4 pillars: investment in infrastructure and rolling out new infrastructure. That hasn't really come into play yet, although it's on the cards and they're working on it. But if you look at public investment, it's actually declined in the last 2 quarters. So clearly there has to be a lot of action to turn that around. Also to fix the electricity and broadband systems, and that means sorting out ESCOM, but also there's a proposal that we should fast track access to broadband by increasing particularly private activity in that sector. Those are very big structural reforms to the economy. The third element is industrialization, with an increasing emphasis based on localization, which has implications for procurement, as well as on exports. And finally, there's the employment stimulus program, which is to date has centered primarily on putting teachers' aides in classrooms. So in effect, in some ways, we're trying to deal with the shortcomings in education by a completely innovative program of adding support for teachers from people in the community as part of the public employment schemes. If we look at resourcing, like we said, there are severe fiscal constraints, and that's going to affect, I think, everything the public sector does, and it does lead, as you know, to very tough choices. And in effect, in response to strategy in the recovery program is to say, how can we crowd in private resources through public-private partnerships and infrastructure? And those things are easier said than done, because as the program acknowledges, you need to ensure that the private investor makes a profit. It's really hard to make a profit off things like providing water to households in the Eastern Cape in the rural areas who can't afford to pay for it. The second way that people talk about crowding in private resources is effectively through local procurement, because the argument is that stimulates local manufacturing, diversification of the economy. But as everybody who works in government knows, you have to balance the cost and the benefits. You have to decide how much you're willing to pay for it. In the event, local procurement regulations are very hard to manage and not easily enforced. And I think when we talk about skills development, that's one area where most supply chain managers don't really understand the process, even to the extent it's possible within the existing procurement rules. We've also tried to roll in private support for healthcare and vaccinations, including, for instance, through the Solidarity Fund and the role of discovery in the vaccinations program in particular. And like I said, with the employment stimulus and education, in some ways reflects a way of bringing in community efforts at a lower cost than it would be to hire public servants at full price. And then finally, we're trying to use the state-owned companies, as we always have, for infrastructure. But part of the problem is that in the last 10 years, their financial situation has become almost untenable. Many of them are heavily have been dependent on sort of periodic government support. If that support vanishes, they have to undergo very large-scale restructuring. You can see the proposals ESCOM has put out, which are transformative. But for some of them, like Denel or the mining company, it's not clear how far they'll be able to go without continuous state support. If we look at the context, because I think it's important to understand where we're coming from, there's a couple of things that shape the role of the public service and where we fit into it. Firstly, South Africa is, of course, a highly unequal democracy. And that leads to this contradiction in power structures where you have the political system, which is supposed to be accountable to the electorate, and everybody, all citizens are supposed to be equal. But it's in a context of a very unequal economy where some people simply have far more resources and power based on those resources. And also there are groups that are better organized than others. So for instance, the unions and high income suburban residents associations tend to have power that other people who are not organized will not be able to wield. And that's a contradiction again with the idea that under democracy, everybody has equal voice. What that means for government decision makers is they have to manage stakeholders and at the same time satisfy their constituencies, that is the voters. And where they have, as is often true in very unequal societies, contradictory demands, that can be really difficult. And in effect, to put it bluntly, we need to try and avoid both capital flight and uprisings and protest action. And getting that balance right is hard, as we found out in July. So I could argue that the uprisings in July reflected the decision that we would pacify our creditors in business by cutting off relief to the poor. And we didn't really take into account that the poor also have ways to act. They also have power, besides beyond the vote. The other thing is, as you know, we have state systems that are somewhat problematic. Firstly, they're fragmented between the spheres and functions. If you look at the institutional structure of the state, a lot of functions are divided, for instance, between national provinces and municipalities and between government departments. So if you look at issues around, for instance, managing coal and electricity, you've got DMRE, you've got environmental affairs, you also have the Department of Labor, you have the province, and you have the municipalities. And those are just a few of the departments that are involved in that process. We also have to remember that the systems of the state that we inherited were not designed for democracy. So if you look at the internal bureaucratic decision-making and implementation systems, they were designed before 94 to exclude the public and to avoid accountability to the public, to support mining and commercial agriculture rather than most kinds of industries, to protect centers of excellence rather than serve the majority. So you'd have a few schools and a few hospitals that were world-class, but the majority didn't have services at all. Given limited resources, that's been very hard to think about how do we change that. And also they have been largely designed to avoid risk and to avoid disruption. And particularly the budget process has really been very risk averse in the sense of they want to avoid new programs that fail. If a new program fails, everybody gets blamed and treated as if they were corrupt. But if you don't introduce a new program and society runs into trouble, you're not blamed in the same way. And that leads people to being risk averse and not taking actions that are necessary, even though the consequence of not taking those actions, the costs for society are actually higher. And then finally, we have a long tradition, as you know, of measuring against activities and outputs rather than outcomes and impacts, which leads people to say, I'm going to abide by the rules, I'm going to do what I've agreed to do, for instance, under the annual performance plan, even though it's become irrelevant. And I have to say these things are particularly difficult in the economics departments because in the economics departments, by definition, we're trying to manage the private sector, which is outside the state. So something like the APP works better in health and education, where the vast majority of actors are inside the state, than when you're trying to get business to do things and where you don't control the entire environment. So even the problems you're addressing may change dramatically. Just as all APPs became irrelevant the moment the pandemic hit, but it's very hard to change an APP. The procedures are difficult, so you end up going through the motions of adhering to the APP, even though it no longer applies. We said we would shift that by moving to outcomes-based approaches, but although the MPSF is there, as you all know, in practice, it's the APP that we all pay attention to. And then finally, we are bringing in people into the public service whose academic training was largely still reflects the curricula that were designed in the West and that were designed to maintain stability in the global North, not to meeting the demands of the South African electorate, which wants disruption. So for instance, in economics, the focus is entirely on getting the GDP to grow. There's very little discussion of how would you shape the economy to deal with the climate crisis or to deal with joblessness and inequality if that were your priority. Similarly with engineering, people don't learn how to, supply new kinds of water and electricity in rural areas, as opposed to sort of standard engineering for the mines. This isn't to say that the old curricula are all bad, obviously, but that they're not clear to the problems that face the core constituencies of the state. But also academic training, that definitely does not help you to deal with the public in terms of communication, managing de-escalation, negotiations, win-win negotiations preferably, or mediation, or any of those issues around what you need to do to be responsive to the public and public needs if you're in the public service. So what are the implications for skills development? Well, firstly, we need to start by saying, how do we reinterpret economics and politics for our democracy? And obviously, I would argue everybody in senior management and middle management in the public service needs a greater understanding of economic and political processes. That what economics teaches us in politics is sometimes we don't have power. How do we manage that? Who does have power? How do we think about the limits on our power? Because as we all know, too often people come up with programs that look great on paper, but actually aren't viable because we don't have the capacity or the power to implement them. And I think economic and politics helps us think about those things better, or should. But also, again, that we have to talk about how do we rethink economics for public servants who have to meet the needs of a different constituency, which is working people in the poor primarily, that is the majority of voters. What would that mean if we're saying we're trying to solve problems in the economy, not just for economic growth and investment, but rather for equality and job creation? The mechanisms that reproduce inequality are differentials in assets, in work organization, education infrastructure, and in location. How do we think about ensuring that people think through as they implement their programs and policies, are we creating more equity in these areas? And then finally, obviously, it's really important that people understand the role of the state, but also the roles of the spheres, that very few public servants in my experience really understand the constitutional allocation of functions and how that and our history shapes the capacity and the structures of the different spheres of the state. A second area that's becoming increasingly important is risk management. The nature of disruption is it increases risks. The nature of people is we would rather ignore those risks than manage them. And that tends to lead us to not changing our behavior and our policies when actually we really have no choice. The cost of failure to change will be higher. So how do we help people to deal with disruption and innovation? How do we ensure, part of that is to say we need to look at outcomes and evaluate where we are getting to those outcomes and let that guide our actions rather than just falling back on rules. But there are standard things you can do around risk management. To start, just evaluating this. But the second thing is also, for instance, to continuously evaluate how you're moving, like I said, and then be sure that you act to manage the possible costs, rather than just digging yourself continuously deeper into the hole. A third thing is we need more evidence-based policy development because the risks are high. Because we're having to change what we do rapidly, it's really important to think about how we use evidence in a situation of high risk and rapid change. Part of that is how do we get the evidence we need? How do we manage research? But also being aware that we're never going to get the perfect evidence. We don't have time for academic studies. So what kinds of evidence can we use, can we get when we're under time constraints? I think using the socioeconomic impact assessment process that requires people to really think through the costs of their proposals, not just the benefits, and also the risks. We've all seen bad proposals go through cabinet because people come there and say, if it works, it will create 1 million jobs. And they don't say the chances of it working is about 5%. And that the costs are extreme. So I think it's very important that we people think through how they can use these kinds of processes to strengthen their work rather than seeing it as either a tick box or a threat to their cherished proposals. And then the whole issue around the theory of change and really thinking through logically, how does your policy work? What could go wrong? Again, all of this are ways to try and make people step back from their proposals and make them as strong as possible. Having said that, again, and this is linked to risk management, when you're in the middle of a pandemic, when you're in the middle of a global depression like we haven't seen since the 30s, you have to take some risks. The question is, you have to be able to manage those risks. You're never going to get the perfect evidence, but you have to move on the preponderance of the evidence, but then be willing to fix things if more evidence comes up and it turns out you got it wrong. And then finally, and I think that, the introduction said this as well, we need to think more about how we deal with constituencies and stakeholders. There's a range of skills around that. Virtually no public servants that I know who are public facing in any way are actually trained to think about how do you manage these processes, and particularly engagements around policy and implementation. So one of the issues is that, really the people need to think through, there are different reasons we engage. We can engage to get information. So as like participatory research, like when you have public hearings on something, we can engage to mobilize people to support a policy. Public servants probably shouldn't do that, but they do it all the time. So you have a meeting with people will support you to get them to go and lobby for you, but also to help you with implementation. And we can engage for pacting. So we want to reach agreements with other people who have power. What I think is extremely important is that we people think through those reasons, because you'll have different people in the room and different approaches in those cases. I also think people need to think about issues around negotiations, communication, and de-escalation. We need more capacity for mediation and dispute settlement in the public service, so we don't always end up fighting for no reason. And we need also to think through what are our mandating systems and how do they function. So in sum, a lot of these things, and I think this is the issue about continuity and change. Obviously, many of these things were necessary before. What the pandemic has done is put all of society under greater stress. That leads to greater demands on government, and particularly greater demands to deal with different groups that have been marginalized, groups that are not always well organized or able to articulate their needs or engage on their needs well. And if we don't have these kinds of competencies built into our programs, we can end up with more disruption, greater conflict, and worse service delivery. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Neva Makgetla, for such a wonderful presentation and the lessons that you have shared with us in that respect. What came out very striking for me, which I think us as public servants, we must take as a message forward, is that we must have a basic understanding of the political and economic situation in the country. And as the National Development Plan calls it, that public servants must be immersed in the developmental agenda of the country. I think that's what you mean. Because our work, we must understand our work in the context that whatever that we do must contribute to building a united, non-racial, democratic, and prosperous South Africa. Others may ask, why do I mention that building a united, non-racial, non-sexist? The thing is that if you do not have equitable development, you are undermining national unity, you are undermining the national project. And then without inclusive and equitable development also, you are undermining our project to create a prosperous South Africa. So us as public servants must understand that mandate, the basic political mandate of South Africa, the economic situation of South Africa, in order to build a united and prosperous South Africa. The events of July, actually, Inequality has shown in the main what it can do. So whatever that we do, we must and always seek to promote equitable and inclusive development, and most importantly, embrace innovation and disruption. How do we manage innovation and disruption so that we can continue serving our people? So right now, I'd like to call on Prof. Maseremule to come and give a presentation on reimagining and developing public service in the time of COVID from an academic perspective. Prof. Maseremule, over to you.
Good morning, Bongani. I hope you can hear me clearly. And good morning to all our virtual audience. And thank you so much to the National School of Government. You'll pardon me, I am actually doing it the traditional way. I don't have the slides. However, I will share my notes, my lecture notes with the National School of Government for distribution. Let me start by saying that human ingenuity has a way of creating a sense of optimism with words. One of those is that every cloud has a silver lining. In other words, there is always something good in every bad situation. All what is required, however, is to find the good in the bad situation and use it to the best of our advantage. As some will say, never let a good crisis go to waste. But what is good in the crisis that COVID-19 pandemic has created, which we can leverage on? Let me answer this question by sharing a very interesting story of my professional experience recently. As you introduced me earlier, Bongani, you said that I am actually working for a university as the executive dean of the faculty. Indeed, I am. I had just signed off the annual report for my faculty's research output for the academic year 2020. And I realized that in terms of the total number of articles published in accredited journals, the research output of the faculty has increased exponentially compared to 2019. And in a faculty research committee meeting, which I chair, I asked my staff about this surge in research productivity. And the answer was, COVID-19 has awakened us from the slumber of the sanctuary of normalcy and jolted our intellectual moves. And I said, wow, something good came out of the pandemic. I thought I should share this, which of course is flattering. However, the moral of the story does not lie in the vanity, but how moments of uncertainties create impulses for high performance. We need to pay a closer attention to this important human attribute. Let's harness it to build resilient organizations. I'm saying this because the literature on the faith of organization during turbulent times talk more about a leader as a factor of their survival, carrying everybody along, not so much about those who are led. Of course, a leader must lead. However, the imaginative ingenuity of those who are led should always be recognized and embraced as an opportunity to lead the leader. This is my takeaway from my encounter with my researchers in my faculty, which I'm using to preface this lecture, as I think it resonates with its theme, resilient public service responsive to the coronavirus pandemic in the year of Charlotte Matseke. And I'm particularly thrilled by Matseke's inscription in the theme of this important conversation. This is because its appropriateness lies in the fact that her life indeed epitomizes resilience, and which is an important concept which shape our imagination as we contend with the challenge of managing state affairs. As I was preparing for this lecture, I receded to my own moment of sobriety, preoccupied with many thoughts, trying to make sense of the disruptive implication of COVID-19. In many ways, this pandemic connotes interregnum. However, the extent of its implication is yet to be fully appreciated in its aftermath. Because of this, I must admit that I am angsty as my excitement about the research productivity in my faculty as the silver lining of the COVID-19 may be a bit premature. However, does this necessarily mean that the lesson I shared earlier that, especially in moments of crisis, a leader must lead, but the imaginative ingenuity of those who are led should always be recognized and embraced as an opportunity to enhance organizational performance necessarily force off? I don't think so. You may ask yourself the question, where am I going with all this? The answer is simple. In moments of crisis, the only way out is imaginative thinking. And this is a function of asking the right question in a relevant context for the correct purpose. My familiarity with these logics lies in the fact that I am from the tradition that instead of teaching students to answer questions, we should teach them to ask them. My entry into the issue that we have virtually gathered here this morning to tackle is from the perspective of an academic who understands the role of the university has been to wrestle with questions whose answers are not known, rather than to expound what is known. In other words, no matter their inconvenience, they should be asked for the debate to unfold, especially those that relate to statecraft in moments of crisis. Coronavirus caught the global community napping. At the time of its outbreak, science had already forewarned way back of infectious diseases or pandemics as among the dangers that humanity faces in the 21st century. But why did statecraft not ramp up proactive capacity to counteract or lessen the devastation of the pandemic? Doesn't this expose the inadequacies of the capacity of nation states to deal with the setbacks of the century? Many bemoans the quality of public leadership as the reason for this. However, doesn't this rather call into a question the quality of higher education, which credentialize those who oversee the state affairs? I'm asking this question because it implicates knowledge, skills, higher education churn out, and therefore it can be turned around, and therefore this question can be turned around to ask when a higher education equips the public service with knowledge, skills that prepare it for the challenges of the century. However, often when these type of questions are asked, the temptation is to resort to simplicity. If there is one thing that COVID-19 has revealed, is that managing public affairs is complex. As I indicated earlier, pandemics are among the things said to be disruptive of human progress in this century. Studying them to inform policy is therefore critically important to improve the quality and longevity of life. But as the scientist, which is the journal, reports, most of the work on diseases hasn't really been coming up with models and predictions, including that on COVID-19. All largely they do is to just simply do what we call outbreak analytics. The study of diseases focuses on the characteristics of the pandemic rather than equally on how the outbreak will unfold, how many people will become infected, and how many will die. This is even though statistical mathematical methods had already been introduced in the study of diseases in the 20th century. However, should it really be those who study diseases to design models for projection and predictions? Isn't that statistical or mathematical modeling belongs to other fields such as the actual sciences, which uses mathematics, statistics, probability principle to predict how the future is likely to unfold? If science is still battling with these questions, can we really blame statecraft for failure to put in place measures to counteract or lessen the impact of COVID-19 pandemic? In other words, how does policy making forecast the epidemics, pandemics, where science did not model their implications? I'm not asking these questions to absorb the complicity of statecraft in how COVID-19 pandemic has unfolded to wreak havoc and decimate the economies of many countries, but to make a point that for science to shape the strategic orientation of statecraft, especially in times of national disasters, it must be complete to provide insight for policy choices and proactive interventions. COVID-19 brings science and policy interface into sharp focus. However, we all know that their intersection has always been complex and tenuous. The reasons for this are many. Chiefly among them is that often policy processes look at science dismissively. This is not surprising, as the realms of science and policies are the function of different contexts. Science establishes the truth, while policies serve political mandate. Often when science contradicts preconceived policy choices, titillating political palate, the attitude of politics becomes unyielding. The wealth of science and politics, despite searching edge for evidence-based policy making in the last 4 decades, continue to evolve side by side. COVID-19 has revealed that this is not tenable anymore, especially on matters that require state action against pathogenic threats. As the Royal Academy of Engineering Fellow at the Imperial College London, Anas Abu Hamed, put it, I quote, "The challenge facing humanity calls for leaders who act based on evidence and respond innovatively to crisis. An important lesson from COVID-19 is that science policy interface should be optimized. However, the viability of this is a function of the credibility of science and states' willingness to uptake the research findings and use them for strategic intervention to enhance the predictive capacity of the state. As I'm talking about all this, I'm thinking about public administration, education, and development programs. And I'm asking myself this question. As managing public affairs is increasingly becoming complex, do these programs sufficiently provide the knowledge and the skills of this century? I'm asking this question as I've been making observations of my own. Typical public administration, education, and development programs appear to be oblivious to the reality of the century, where the pandemics, terrorism, global warming, and unstable global economy are increasingly emerging as the major threats of human progress in the 21st century, especially in South Africa. Their curricula do not include aspects such as peace and security, climate change, economics, and modeling for policy and strategic planning. Their preoccupations are likely with systems and processes of government, which is okay, but they need to go beyond that. It is because of this that often this inevitable question arises. Do higher education systems still serve the purpose? Some are cynical as they, in responding to this question, in saying that largely higher education or our universities exist simply for credentialism as a function of an individualist, materialist, and consumerist ethos. Often when critiques of this sort are made, Ivy League universities feign exceptionalism. However, if Philip Brighton's article titled Harvard Master of Apocalypse is anything to go by, the crisis of education at the university cuts across in both the developing and developed countries. He published a very interesting article in the Times of London, where he argued that Harvard-trained MBA graduates played a leading role in creating the 2008 global financial crisis. Of course, Brighton is a Harvard graduate of his business school, and his article stirred debates, which Harvard Business Review, which is the journal of Harvard University, hosted some of those debates, where the question was, how could MBAs from this prestigious university have been involved in activities that cause so much damage to the economy and society? Interestingly, the financial crisis, as caused by the deregulation of the American financial sector, happened at the time George Bush was at the helm as the 43rd president of the United States of America. I am saying this to say that, indeed, George Bush is a Harvard MBA graduate. The dean of the school, Jay Light, following the crisis and respond to the MBA debate, said this calls for great introspection, for which quality assessment processes were instituted to answer the question about how well its graduates were prepared before the financial crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the question we should be asking, especially that COVID-19 has demonstrated itself as one of the major disruption that happened 2 decades of a century. In other words, we should be asking ourselves the question that we are still in our nascent insofar as the 21st century is concerned. But the question is, what more is to come? And how much are we prepared for that more which is to come? We need to ask ourselves those questions because we don't want to be caught napping, like as we reacted to COVID-19. And as we ask this question, we need to even be more specific about the public service skills, the public service education that need to be put in place to ensure that the public service of the future is well equipped for any eventuality of the 21st century. Let me come to this point again later and finish the point about the MBAs. The quality of the MBA qualification had long been a concern. It predates the global financial crisis. And I am actually emphasizing the challenge insofar as the MBA is concerned, because many schools of government, not only in South Africa, but elsewhere, were modeled along business schools. Especially in the 80s, businesses flourished with high productivity growth. And this was largely ascribed to MBA graduates. While the private sector was doing well, that time, the public sector was riddled with bureaucratic inefficiencies. It was assumed that for it to be turned around, it should be run along business principle. Government officials enroll for MBAs to acquire business skills. The new public management, which emerged during the 1980s as a template for state reform along neoliberal lines, institutionalized the logic of running government like a business. Various schools of government or various schools in government studies embrace the new public management as the cornerstone of their curricular development endeavors. Some even changed their designation from public administration to public management. The new public management became a staple guide in the education of students of government, who were taught that the performance of the state is the function of the economic value of efficiency, largely derived from corporatization practices and the reduction of public expenditure. This decimated the publicness of public administration and decontextualized its embeddedness in the values of democracy. As the offshoot of the neoliberal order, the new public management appended the contours of the administration of states. The market displaced the sovereignty of the people, and the public good became a transaction. This trivialized citizens to customers. The poor, who depend on the public service to survive, are at the receiving end of the state being a service insurer rather than a service provider. This has exacerbated inequality. The new public management failed to fulfill its central promise of efficiency. What did it do instead? It institutionalized greed as manifest in the contestations among politicians, bureaucrats, private providers or consultants about how to profit from the state. The new public management is a grand narrative fiction which promise a false idea. Despite this, it had so much influence that it shaped modules and sequencing, and it was used to sequence academic curricula for students of government. This explains the disparate state of government studies. The new neoliberal instrumentalism of the new public management narrative reduced education to forms of training to create technocrats with orientation that government is like a business and should therefore be run as such. While this valorizes business principle, it vitiates the publicness of public administration as a normative addition that set public organizations apart from other organizations. Public organizations exist for the public good. In the government studies, framed in the logic of the new public management, this is lost in defining state performance as the function of the virtues of 3 E's: economy, efficiency, effectiveness. These are a means to an end, not the end in themselves. And in many ways, these inadequacies of the new public management inspired programs are similar to those of business schools. As Harvard professor Rakesh Khurana argued, the basic model that makes up the frame, the fabric of the contemporary business education has drifted away from the original mission of creating a true management profession for the benefit of society. While government studies create technocrats, which in some instances do not have an ideational acumen, business education churn out consultants, hedge fund hotshots, who, as Brighton argued, have created the economic system that has created an enormous amount of hardship for people. That I intermittently refer to business school in this conversation is because many in the employ of the states are MBA graduates. There is nothing wrong with that. The point that I'm trying to make is that reimagining and developing public service skills for the future based on our experiences of COVID-19 should start with the education of public servants. And that education ought to expose them to a correct orientation. And as I think about this, I often wonder whether the description of our education and development programs in our universities and elsewhere as public administration or public management, are they still useful? I'm asking this question because there is a trend which is emerging that largely there is a shift from public administration or public management as the nomenclature used to characterize your education and development programs. In South Africa also, it's quite interesting that we might have actually seen the launch of Thabo Mbeki School of Public and International Affairs, right? Compared to public administration or public management. What does public affairs as a nomenclature for an instructional program and a description of a qualification represent, both at the level of theory and practice? In answering this question, it is perhaps important to mention that how a program is named is indicative of the trajectory of ideas that shapes thinking and a particular direction that the discipline is taking. Let me hasten to say the notion of public affairs, which I seem to be inclined to, is not new in the parlance of the discourse in the field, but it has not been used as widely as public administration as a description of the field of government studies. It is only a time not long ago, especially in the United States, that the schools of government studies started to use public affairs in their naming and description of their programs. Although some added other descriptives such as international policy study and citizenship. Example of these schools that I'm referring to are your Lyndon Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University, and Maxwell School of Citizenship, Public Affairs and Policy Studies at Syracuse University. As one of the outstanding scholars in government studies, Nicholas Henry remarked, the notion of public affairs betokens a field that is maturing, growing more intellectually powerful, and making contribution to society. While American schools have made important progress in their reinvention, including their instructional programs around the concept of public affairs, those in the developing countries remain stuck in the shibboleths of the Wilsonian scholarship and the new public management. The Wilsonian scholarship's proposition is that government studies should start from the base of management rather than the foundation of law and politics, while the new public management prescribed market principle for the administration of the state. In the developing countries, various curricular endeavors are often nothing more than isomorphic mimicry of Euro-American templates, which in many ways are contextless global blueprints. The concept of public affairs embodies a set of ideas emerging to shape direction that government studies gravitates towards. It brings back the publicness of public administration as a normative addition that distinguishes state institutions, not simply based on their locus in society, but their uniqueness, which lies in their commitment to public interest as the foundation of the public good. As a field of study, public affairs is broader in scope as it includes the totality of all societal aspects necessary to optimize coexistence, which a typical public administration or public management program executes. Important concepts embodying ideas that structure its theoretical essence are the public good and public interest. That we are discussing. I am talking about public affairs as a trend in government studies at a time the decoloniality trend seeks epistemic justice and the technology is at the highest peak, spawning disruptive innovation becomes intellectual insight for theorizing beyond neoliberal templates. Managing public affairs in the public interest simply means being concerned with the people as a whole, the objective being to enhance their well-being. And the measure of this is the state of happiness. This is the function of the commitment to the public good. I often refer to Ian McLean, who is a professor of English at Oxford University, who beautifully defined public good as any good that, if supplied to anybody, is necessarily supplied to everybody, and from whose benefits it is impossible or impractical to exclude anybody. Theorizing government studies for instructional purposes should draw from the philosophy of humanism. I am emphasizing this to make a point that as we reimagine public service skills, we need to also fundamentally deal with the content of the education that the universities are giving to future public servants. In other words, the outcome of learning should always be understand that the task of promoting the social welfare is for men and women whose duty in the employ of the state is simply to serve with altruism. This is the way to institutionalize an element of humanism in what we are doing. And COVID-19 could not have actually reminded us about this more better. As I move towards the conclusion of my talk, I want to bring in another important point related to the implication of technology on government studies, because COVID-19 is not the only major disruption technology also has. It is at the highest peak. It has found what many refer to as disruptive innovation. We all know a descriptive phrase for this, the fourth industrial revolution, which is defined as the interplay of automation, biotechnology, nanotechnology, and communication. It has appended human coexistence and changed the nature of work. For IR, heralded the age of artificial intelligence. Existing knowledge and skill set are therefore, because of all these major disruptions in the first 2 decades of the 21st century, are set to change. Particularly that if one is to look at some of the studies that are coming, it is said that particularly in South Africa, I am referring specifically to the 2018 Accenture study, which has predicted that about 6 million jobs in South Africa are likely to be lost to automation. What does all this say as they relate to the education of the public service, as they relate to the public service skills that are needed for us to be able to contend with the challenges of the 21st century? It means that as universities, as institutions of learning, as training institutions, we need to go back and rethink the content, the essence of the knowledge that we churn out to our students. We need to begin to seriously rethink the theological insight, the theological logic that shape the content of what constitutes your education, your public administration, your public management, or rather your public affairs education program. At the core ought to be all those important issues that I referred to earlier on. The basis of theorizing what ought to be the epistemological basis of our programs ought to largely take into account the concept of the public good, the concept of public interest, and of course we do have our own philosophy of humanism. But also more importantly, there are other important skills that we need to emphasize. These are these are predictive analytical skills. In other words, if you are to look at how COVID-19 has actually challenged us all, it means that we should institutionalize capacity within the state to develop what we call national resilience systems. And where do we develop that capacity? Universities must step up. Universities must start to think out of the box. And in doing so, we should always make sure that we maintain a close interaction with the world of practice. Predictive analytical skills are critically important. The ability to read research outcomes and translate them into policy formation and translate them into a strategy is critically important. And also, lastly, we must make sure that we assume a multidisciplinary approach as we educate the future public servant. We are emphasizing all these critically important aspects, largely based on what we have experienced as a result of the challenges that emanated from COVID-19. But like as I indicated earlier on, as we talk about that, we shouldn't forget that also there is another major disruption that we are yet to adequately contend with, and that is technology, the fourth industrial revolution. Ladies and gentlemen, like as I indicated earlier on, in each and every cloud, there is a silver lining. I said what I said, but I am very hopeful, I am very optimistic that we are actually going to get it right. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you very much, Prof, for such a wonderful presentation, which of course makes us think or rethink what should constitute or what goes into public affairs. As you rightly said, the takeaways that I took from your presentation, Prof, is that COVID-19 has awakened us from the slumber of normalcy. But the question that I have is that, have we woken up? Are we ready to wake up to that reality? What is it that we're doing as public servants that we are now being woken up to that reality, out of normalcy? And then you say that public policy and science cannot be separated, that we need evidence-based policy making to come to the fore. We need things, we do things such as big data analytics. We need that in the public service in order to remain relevant and to make sure that our policy is responsive. That is so because, like you say, public affairs is increasingly becoming complex in the face of emerging contemporary issues such as climate change, cybersecurity, terrorism, and many other things. And then you also said that policy must not look at science dismissively. That is the interface between policy and evidence to make evidence policy making. And then you also mentioned, Prof, that we, okay, not that you mentioned that, I was remarking today that we, as the National School of Government, cognizant of the fact that we need evidence policy making, we've been doing things such as economic governance to train our public sector officials in that field. And then you also said that public admin education must embrace a shift into public affairs. So those are some of the key takeaways that I took. So thank you very much for that wonderful intervention there, Prof. I'd like to say to our audience that we, in the chat, we have posted various links there. You can download various material. There's a link to the evaluation of the webinar. It will pop up after. It will pop up after we have closed the session. So please just remain there and complete the evaluation link. And then you'll also see a number of training programs, brochures that we have posted there. Soraya will now read out the questions, and then Dr. Niba Makhetla and Prof. Masemula will attend to those questions. Soraya, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Dr. Makhetla, you indicated that you would like to answer some of those questions. So I'm going to ask you to proceed.
Okay, I'm just going to try and summarize some of them because some of them are fairly long. And I'm just going to look at them in the order in which they appear, which is not necessarily the order in which they were put out there. Okay, so there's an issue about more women than men holding insecure, informal, and lower paying jobs. In fact, what's interesting is that so just to be clear, we're not like other countries. Informal work, if you exclude domestic work, which is put in a separate category, it's about 50-50 men and women. Formal work, it's about a third women. Domestic work, I'm sure you're surprised to hear, is almost entirely women. What that means is because domestic and informal have bounced back while formal in the last quarter, lower level formal workers, particularly production workers, lost jobs. Women and men have now lost pretty much the same number of jobs. Now, women are starting off with a deficit in employment. But nonetheless, it's not what you see in some countries where women have been harder hit. I do think, since we're in the public service, it's worth pointing out that a peculiar thing about South African labor market is the public service, because we have a national public service, which includes health and education workers, it's always provided a way into the professions for women, because those do tend to be women-dominated caring professions, as you know. So it may be underpaid compared to other people with similar educational qualifications, but it's always provided a way for some women, a disproportionate share compared to other countries, to get into professions and to have stable employment. So I think one of the concerns about cutting remuneration in the public service and possibly cutting employment in the public service is that you're actually hitting at one of the few ways that particularly Black women have been able to get into the profession. But in terms of the impact of COVID, it's not been particularly hard on women, except to the extent that as care workers in the health sector, they've obviously faced higher risks and longer days, and emotional stress. In terms of last in, first out, yeah, some companies use the occasion to fire more expensive senior people, but it actually doesn't happen that much because usually they need the skills. So if you have lower skilled jobs, you'd expect to see that. In practice, now I have to admit, I have not done this for the last quarter, but certainly up to the first quarter of 2021, it was amazing if you break it down by age, the extent to which basically there was no net job losses for older workers, and all the job losses were concentrated on people between the ages of 18 and 30, which is around 40% of total employment. And the disproportion was really shocking to see. I think that, I don't know, in the UK and the US, they have rebounded more and they haven't faced a third wave. And their tourism industry is much more dependent on domestic travel. Part of the problem with our tourism industry, particularly the high end, which is really around the Western Cape, is that international travel is still very problematic, and people don't want to come here until we have the pandemic under control. I think we're kidding ourselves if we think that people will travel to South Africa. It's a long haul flight, which many people are reluctant to take. And then you get here, and if we're in the middle of another wave, if we haven't rolled out the vaccinations, obviously people will be unwilling to join. It is normally true, and this is true also in the US and the UK, that if you look at employment participation, for instance, that they are running into shortages more, I understand, in the US and the UK, because people are reluctant to go back to work. So if you look at the share of working age people with employment, that's still below where it was. But people in particularly public-facing jobs, often they're finding it harder to get people into those jobs, and people want to be better paid because of the risk. So I'm not sure it's that simple, but what I would say is every downturn we've ever seen in the economy, employment has you've tended to lose jobs later and then have them rebound more slowly, because companies, they don't want, when they're in a very risky situation like we are now with COVID, companies don't want to employ people until they know that it's secure. And then on top of that, you have the fact that the whole point of the COVID-19 surge was to say, we will pay you as long as you maintain the employment relationship. So when they've now restricted it only to companies that actually face legal restrictions, which is really just hospitality and liquor. So everybody else promptly fired everybody if they didn't need them, because there have been big shifts in the economy. And although there's recovery, there are big differences between industries. In terms of, I don't know that it helps to say systemic failure to implement cabinet decisions and government policies should be seen as sort of treason. I don't know that that helps. I think we need to ask, why is it that our policies aren't implemented? And I would certainly argue that really, we keep saying we have good policies, but what we usually mean by that is we like the objectives of the policy. But that's not a good policy. A good policy is one which has functional mechanisms to achieve its aims. So we need to say, do we have policies that specify the activities and the outputs and who is responsible for them that are sufficient to achieve the impacts that we have said we want? So yes, it's very nice the government wants, full employment, more equity, better education, blah, blah. But if we don't have programs in place that are capable of achieving them, then I don't think we should blame the public servants who are doing their best. I think we need to say, we need to think much more about how do we use things like a theory of change, like SEAS, to ensure that we have policies that are high quality in the sense of being able to deliver the aims, not just stating good aims, but having no actual way to achieve them. And as far, look, you'd have to ask the DPSA. As far as I know, we're not doing a repository of innovation. We do not have a learning organization generally. And honestly, given the stretch on capacity, I don't think it will happen soon. Those are the questions that were there before. Chair, I don't know if you want me to answer the new ones, which I assume are for Professor Masaru.
Yeah, Prof. Masaru may take those new questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Bongani. Look, I think, like as I indicated earlier, we should try to develop within the public service system what I will actually call a predictive capacity. In other words, we should have an ability to read the future, to read the possibility of certain things happening, right? And that is something that I don't really think that we have paid so much attention to. Particularly in terms of how we have organized our program to educate and train our public servant. Somebody earlier on made reference to what happened in South Africa in terms of those unfortunate looting that took place. And we have all blamed the fact that our intelligence services perhaps was kidnapping, or we don't have a strong intelligence service. It's fine, but I want us not to deal with that only from the security point of view. I want us to mainstream in our curriculum, right? Some kind of instructions around how can one read the future? How can one read the possibility of certain things happening? So that the entirety of the public service could have the capacity, right, to always think about the future, and also to think about how it should reposition itself appropriately in response to the possibility of certain things happening in the future. And for me, That is important. The second important aspect that I want to underscore relates to the capacity to build what I will refer to as a national resilience system. In other words, the ability to withstand adversity, crisis in diverse realms by implementing changes and adaptation without harming the society's core values and institutions, right? I think also as we reimagine how we can actually teach the future public servant, these for me are critically important things that we need to really start to put more emphasis on. And earlier on, I think I saw a question about the elements of a capable developmental state. It's quite interesting because if you go to the chapter in the National Development Plan and compare the fundamental issues that it talks about as they relate to a capable developmental state are largely, those aspects that you'll actually get in our Constitution, chapter 10 of the Constitution, right? Those are the elements that ought to constitute our capable developmental state. The question of the development orientation of our public service, but also what is critically important, we'll obviously talk to the question of building a very strong state capacity. And also, how do we do that? There are many ways, there are many ways, and key among them is the question of professionalizing the public service, like as we are currently doing. It basically includes many aspects. But also for me, we need to begin to also ensure that our development orientation even exists in the minds of the very same in the minds of our public servants. In other words, they should always have this impulse of saying that I am here to serve, and it takes the synergy of efforts. It takes the totality of us all to make sure that at the end of the day, we achieve this capable developmental state that we want. For example, if we talk about a professionalized public servant, again, university can come and play a critically important role, particularly in terms of how it teaches students. I often argue that in many instances, when we put together an education program, we tend to pay more attention only to developing the cognitive faculty of our students. And often we tend to pay less attention to character formation. For me, there are two fundamental purposes of education: develop the cognitive faculty of students, but also more importantly, shape the character of the students so that when they are enlisted in the markets, they should not just only display their technical, vocational expertise. They should also display a particular character, which is critically important. At some point, I made a very sad observation as I was watching the Zondo Commission that largely most of the people that appear before the commission are damn good, educated people in their own respective professional, fields or technical fields, But listening to the allegations that have been leveled against them, I got the impression that these people went through a system that did not spend time in terms of trying to shape their character. So the point that I'm trying to make is that character formation also is critically important for the purpose of also ensuring that at the end of the day, we achieve an ethical society, which is a critical imperative of moving towards building a very strong state capacity. So these are some of the questions which I think I saw, unless if there is another question which I missed.
There's one question around the assertion about the move from public administration to public management in terms of
Yes.
government being run professionally or on business principles or not, which may disadvantage people who are not necessarily able to pay for services.
In fact, to the contrary, because when you look at how governments have been run, not only in South Africa, but in many parts of the world, within the context of the paradigm of the new public management. Remember, it has always been about emphasizing business principle. It has always been said that government can be run by like a business, and in various instances we have seen instances where as government we even went to the extent of outsourcing certain basic things that could easily be done within the state. To the extent that at some point, as one was doing the analysis, I asked myself the question that, but isn't that here we are dealing with the challenge of two public services, you know, the normal public services as we know it, and another public service which come in the form of contracting out of certain services that could easily be done by people that have been employed to do them within the state. And that is where I think in some instances, the challenge is, because often we end up as a state spending so much on two public services. You know, it will be interesting to quantify how much did we spend in contracting out arrangements, in outsourcing arrangements, you know, and like as I pointed out earlier, sometimes we outsource certain things that can easily be done within the state. So it is not in any way going to disadvantage those people. In fact, it could actually assist us a lot in terms of making sure that we minimize the cost of managing public affairs by making sure that the public servants that are there are engaged fully to do what they have actually been employed to do, you know, than always going out and try to outsource to private providers. In fact, it's quite interesting that in South Africa, some people become millionaires by doing business with government. It's very interesting, you know. So all what I'm trying to say is that there are certain things that we need to begin to pay a closer attention to and start to think about them very critically for us to get what we want right, particularly for the purpose of achieving the commitment that we've made in the National Development Plan, and more importantly, the commitment that we made in our constitution in terms of the type of the state that we want. You know, so in a nutshell, I will say that to the contrary, I think what we are agitating for, moving towards public affairs, it is actually an important shift that seeks to ensure that we optimize the efficiency of the state, we develop the capacity of the state. The state should not depends largely on the private sector to deliver certain services. So that's the point that I was actually trying to make earlier on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Magetle and Prof. Maseremole, for those comments and answers that you have given. We are going to take 2 live questions. So Marty is going to open for 2 hands. If there are questions that you'd like to verbally ask, you can raise your hand, and then Dr. Magetle and Prof. Maseremole, depending on who the question is directed to, will answer. Going once. Marty, tell me if you have opened, and if people can now raise their hands to pose verbal questions. Then after that, we'll hand over to the principal to give the closing remarks.
Bongani, they can raise their hands now.
Okay, colleagues, if you have any verbal questions, you can raise your hand. Ms. Mashiane Helen.
Good morning, colleagues. How are you?
We are fine, thank you. Your question or your comment?
Mine is a follow-up to say, as we build a capable state, what are the elements that must be aligned to the new anti-corruption strategy? Specific questions. Yes, I heard the Prof, but I will be happy if he was to say, for example, the new pillar of the anti-corruption strategy says a citizen participating and whistleblowing mechanism. So what are the elements that can be contained in each pillar? Because I'm working from anti-corruption side, where whatever that I do in building a strategy state must be aligned to the new pillars. Thanks.
Prof. Maseremole, Ms. Mashiane, you may lower your hand.
Thank you so much. The alignment that you are actually talking about, I must say that is critically important, because whatever that we're talking about should always have an element of consistency. In other words, there should be that confluence. The question about
Prof, I think you are frozen there. We cannot hear you anymore. So I would like to call on the principal to give closing remarks. Principal, Prof, you are frozen there. You encountered a technical glitch. So I'll give you a minute to wrap up, and then we'll call on the principal of the NSG to do the closing remarks. Thanks.
Okay, just to wrap up. Firstly, I think maybe we need to move with speed in terms of rethinking our whistle protection system. We need to move with speed in terms of rethinking it, in terms of redesigning it, because in many ways it seems to have been exposed as not really being adequate. Because if you really want to build an ethical society, which is one of the most important things that we want to achieve through a capable developmental state, we need to have a strong what you call anti-corruption system, and the question of whistleblowing becomes one of the critically important element of that. Maybe other aspect that Mama Shian raised, you can just share her contact, my contact with her, then we can take up some other discussion further. But also, Yeah, let me just leave it there. Let me just leave it there.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you, Dr. Neva. Principal, I would like to call on you to come and give the closing remarks. Over to you, Principal.
Thank you to you, Bongani as Program Director, Soraya as Chief Organizer of today's session, as well as our distinguished speakers, Prof. Marcel Moule and Dr. Neva Makhetla. It was indeed a refreshing session that we had today, hearing both perspectives, and there is a meeting point in both what Dr. Makhetla and Prof. Marcel Moule said here today, and I think one of the meeting points, points of convergence between the two of them, is that whatever you do, whether we are organizing public administration or we are designing and implementing a public policy, that is got to have a purpose in it. As Dr. Makhetla spoke about, the need to sharpen, the ability to make economic policies that are effective, that are implementable. And Prof. Marcel Moule spoke about the need to design a public service that is responsive in both the instances. The net effect of shaping public service in that regard will be that it is able to effectively deliver on the mandate that that it has. It's very exciting that we are opening up spaces for experts like these two to come and share perspectives with various people in the public sector. We had a few MECs here earlier on, a few other people who are senior in the state, but also even very curious, young and more junior public servants to join. The life of these masterclasses doesn't end here, it goes beyond it. We receive notices from DGs wanting the links because they use some of this content to influence conversations as they are doing their own strategic planning in their organizations. We also use it as part of teaching when we convene various executive programs as a National School of Government. So mine is easy to thank everybody who came here. We appreciate that you took time to be with us this morning. The link to the recording has been shared, so please do download it. It will also be emailed to you, those of you who did register. We know there's many other questions that we could have engaged with, but time will always be a challenge. When you have sessions like these ones, you keep them at 2 hours, you respect the time of the people, and we will meet again when we interact with them as well as others who will be joining us. So thank you to the organizers. This is part of the Public Service Month, which is September. This is why Tourism Month and the Heritage Month. So the holiday is coming this Friday. So if you do want to make a contribution, do travel to the extent that you can. Spend time somewhere in a B&B, you will be helping to support domestic tourism. And even if you are going to a funeral or going to a wedding, this is regarded as tourism. If you do, book a place somewhere to sleep and you pay a tourism levy. So thank you very much, colleagues, for joining. We are humbled by your presence. Back to you, Bongani.
Thank you, Principal. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you to our speakers. And thank you to everyone who has attended this webinar. Keep a lookout on the NSG social media pages and our website for a series of masterclasses and events that the NSG organizes in the ideation space. Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of our program. Bye-bye to everyone.